Hazation, the world at your fingertips by Bazooka Bizar. Thanks so much for tuning in. Let's talk about historical events about World War I. World War I is also known as the Great War. It began in 1914 after the assassination of our Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. His murder capitulated into a war across Europe that lasted until 1918. During the conflict, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, Central powers back then, fought against Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan, and the United States, the Allied force. Thanks to new military technology and the horrors of trench warfare, World War I saw the unprecedented level of carnage and destruction. By the time the war was over, the Allied power claimed victory. More than 60 million people lost their lives, civilians and soldiers alike. Before the war, there was so many peace treaties with the parties that actually fought against each other. Russia, Ottoman Empire, Britain, Australia, but this event sparked that ignites the first flame of the war, because Siberia actually thought that Austria will wage a full-on war after this event. Siberian nationalists thought they can gain this event to their advantage. So, it's from the Kaiser himself that ruled Germany. And the Kaiser gave that protection, but he secretly pledged his allegiance to the Central powers back then, which is the Ottoman Empire, Russia. Within a week of that move from the Kaiser, William II, Russia, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and Siberia had lined up against Austria, Hungary, and Germany, and World War I had begun. According to an aggressive military strategy known as the Shafik Plan, named for its mastermind, German Field Marshal Alfred von Shafik, Germany began fighting World War I on two fronts, involving France throughout natural Belgium in the west and confronting Russia in the east. On August the 4th, 1914, German troops crossed the border into Belgium in the first battle of World War I. The German assault had heavily fought at the city of Lake, using the most powerful weapons back then. Arsenal, numerous siege cannons to capture the city by August 15. The Germans left death and destruction in their wake as they advanced through the Belgium toward France, shooting civilians and executing Belgian priests they had accused of inciting civilian resistance. The first Battle of Marine. There was actually two battles. The first one began in September. In 1914, French-British forces confronted the invading German army, which had been there, going deep into the northeastern front of France. Within 30 miles of Paris, the Allied troops checked the German advances and mounted a successful counterattack, driving the German back to the north of the Eastern River. The defeat meant the end of German plans for quick victory in France. Both sides dug into trenches, and Western France was setting in a hellish of a war of attribution that would last more than 3 years. Particularly long and costly battles in this campaign were fought in Verdun, February till December 1916. German and French troops suffered close to 1 million casualties in the Battle of Verdun alone. The bloodshed on the battlefield, Western Front in particular, the difficulties its soldier had for years after fighting had ended, inspires such work of art as All Quiet on the West Front by Aiken Murray, In the Flaring Fields by Canadian doctor Lieutenant Colonel John McCare. In the letter, McCare writes from his prospective fallen soldiers. He says, "To you from falling hands we threw the torch, by yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields." Published in 1950, the poem inspired the use of poppy as a symbol of remembrance. Visual artists like Arthur Dix of German and British painters William Lewis, Paul Nash, and David Bermig used their fascinated experience as soldiers in the World War I to create their art, capturing the anguish of tarnish and the warfare that exploded In 1914, with military technology as the theme of the war, with violence as a landscape that dismembered the whole European continent. The Eastern Front. On the Eastern Front of World War I, Russia forces invaded Germany's held region of East Prussia and Poland, but were stopped short by German and Austrian forces at the Battle of Tannenberg in late August 1914. Despite the victory, Russia's assault forced Germany to move to corps from the Western Front to the Eastern, contributing to the German loss in the Battle of Marine. Combine this with the fire's Allied resistance in France, the ability of Russians' huge warfare machine to mobilize relatively very quickly in the East assured a longer, more gradual conflict instead of quick victory for Germany, had the hope to win under the Shafik Plan. From 1914 till 1916, Russia's army mounted several offensives on World War I Eastern Front, but was unable to break through the German lines ever. Defeat on the battlefield, combined with economic instability and the lack of food and other essentials, led to a mounting discontent among the bulk of Russia's population, especially with the poverty-stricken workers and the peasants especially. This increased hostility was directed toward the imperial regime of the Kaiser Nicholas II and his unpopular German-born wife Alexandria. You know, that reminds me of actually Rasputin. And the song goes, la la la, la la la, once upon a December, should you be here with me? Once upon a December. Rasputin. Anyway, let's go back to the start. Russia's simmering instability exploded in Russia's Revolution of 1917, spearheaded by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, which ended their craziest rule and brought a halt to the Russian... What is this? In World War I. Who wrote this kind of thing? No, actually... Russia was trying to be friendly with the Central Powers in early December 1970, fearing the German troops to face remaining allies on the Western Front. At the height of the fight, in 1914, the United States remained at a standline, both parties in World War I adapting the policy of being neutral, forced by President Woodrow Wilson, while continuing to engage in commerce and shipping with European countries on both sides of the conflict. While being neutral from the United States side, however, it increased difficulty to maintain the face of German unchecked submarine aggression against the neutral ships, including those carrying passengers. In 1915, Germany declared the water surrounding the British Isles to be a war zone, and German U-boats sank several commercial and passenger vessels, including some U.S. ships. This made a wide spectrum in the U.S. population and an outburst of protest over the stricken by the UA boats of the German attacks. The British ocean liner Lusitania, traveling from New York to Liverpool, England, with hundreds of American passengers on board on May 1950, helped turn the tide of American public opinion against Germany. In February 1970, Congress passed $250 million to prepare for the war, intended to make the United States ready for war. The Germans were crazy at that time to sink 4 more ships of U.S. merchant ships on following month, and on April the 2nd, Woodrow Wilson, president back then, appeared before Congress and called for a declaration of war against Germany. Let's talk about the Gallipoli campaign. With World War I having effectively settled into a settlement in Europe, the Allies attempted to score a victory against the Ottoman Empire, which entered the conflict on the side of the Central Powers in late 1914. After a failed attack in a strike linking the Sea of Marmara In the Aegean Sea, Allied forces led by Britain launches a large-scale land invasion of Aleppo Peninsula in April 1915. The invasion also proved dismal failure, and in January 1916 Allied forces staged a full retreat from the shores of the peninsula after suffering 250 casualties. Winston Churchill was among the people who suffered this defeat on the Aleppo campaign in 1916, accepting a commission with infantry battalion in France. British-led forces also combined the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, and Egypt, Macedonia. While the northern Italy, Austria, and Italian troops faced off series of 12 battles along the Aisne River, located in the border between the two nations. We mean Egypt and Macedonia. What happened in the Battle of Aisne? The first Battle of Aisne took place in late spring of 1915. Soon after, Italy entered the war on the side of the Allies, on the 12-ish Battle of Izzo, also known as the Battle of Caprito, October 1917. German reinforcement helped Austria-Hungary win a decisive victory. Well, after Caprito, Italy's allies jumped into an offer, increased resistance. British, French, and later the American troops arrived in the region, and the Allies began an attack back to the Italian front. In the year before the war, the superior Britain Royal Navy was unchallenged by any other nation's fleet, but the Imperial German Navy had made substantial strides in closing the gap between the two naval powers. German strength on the high seas was also aided by the lethal fleet of the U-boat submarines. After the Battle of Dogger Bank in January 1915, in which the British mounted a surprise attack on the German ships in the North Sea, the German Navy chose not to confront British mighty Royal Navy in a major battle for more than a year, preferring to rest the bulk of its Navy strategy on its U-boats. World War I was the first major conflict to harness the power of planes through not just an impactful as the British Royal Navy or the German U-boats. The use of planes in World War I just passed their later pivotal role in the military conflict around the globe. At the dawn of World War I, aviation was relatively a new field and just striking out. Flight just 11 years before, in 1903. Aircrafts were initially used primarily for reinforcement on missions during the First Battle of Marine. Information passed from pilots allowed Allied to exploit a weak spot in the German lines, helping the Allies to push German out of France. The first machine guns were successfully mounted on planes in June 1912 in the US, but it was imperfect. If timed incorrectly, a bullet could easily destroy the pilot and the plane. The Marine Slander L, a French plane, provided a solution. The bullet chain was armed with deflector widgets that prevented bullets from hitting it. The Wurin Slane Type L was used by the French and the British Royal Flight Corporation. Dutch inventor Anthony Fokker improved upon the French deflector system in 1915. His interpreter, the Syndicate, firing the gun with planes, used another rolling avoid collision through his most popular plane during World War I was the single seat that made the Allies win a decisive victory thanks to the mighty airplane powers. His invention created over 40 kind of airplane for the Germans. By the end of the war, the Allies was producing 5 times more aircraft than the German. On April the 1st, 1918, the British created the Royal Air Force, or RAF, the first air force to be separated by the military branch, independent from the Navy or the Army. The Second Battle of Marine With the German able to build up its strength on Eastern Front after the fight with Russia, Allied troops struggled to hold off another German offensive until promised reinforcement from the United States that were arriving very soon. The Second Battle of Marine turned the tide of war decisively toward the Allies, who were able to regain much of France and Belgium in the months that followed. The role of 92 and 93 3rd Division. By the time World War I began, there were 4 all-black regiments in the U.S. Army: the 24th, the 25th Infantry, and the 9th, the 10th Cavalry. All 4 regiments compressed of celebrated soldiers who fought in the Spanish-American War and the American Indian Wars and served in the American territories, but they were not deployed for overseas combat in World War I. The first African-American troops sent overseas served in the labor battalions. Restricted to menial roles in the Army and Navy, the shutdown of Marines entirely. Their duties mostly concluded into uploading, unloading ships, transportation materials from train deposits, bases and ports, digging trenches, cooking, and maintenance. Facing criticism from the black community and civil rights organization for its quotes and treatment of African American soldiers in the war efforts, the military formed 2 black combat units in 1917. The 92 and the 93 divisions, trained separately and exclusively in the U.S., the decision made decisive movement in the war effort. The 92 faced criticism for their performance argue campaign in September 1918. The 23rd Division, however, had more success. With dwindling armies, France asked American for reinforcement. General John Cushing, commander of the American forces, sent regiments in the 93 Division to send over to France, experience fighting alongside black soldiers from their Senegalese French colony army. The 93 Division, 396 regiments, nicknames Harlem Halfites, fought so gallantly with a total of 191 days in the front lines, longer than any AEF regiments, that French awarded them the Croix of Courtie for their heroism. More than 315,000 African American soldiers were serving in the World War I in ferocious capacities. By the fall of 1980, the last battleground, Central Powers were unraveling on all fronts. Despite the Turkish victory in Aleppo, later defeats by invading forces, and an Arab revolt that destroyed the Ottoman economy and devastated its land. And the Turks signed a treaty with the Allies in late October 1918. Austria-Hungary disevolved from within due to growing nationalist movement among its diverse population, reached an amnesty on November 4th, facing dwindling resources on the battlefield, discontent on the home front, and the surrender of its allies. Germany was finally forced to seek amnesty on November 11, 1918, ending the World War I. The famous Treaty of Versailles. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Allied leaders stated their desire to build a post-war world that would build itself against future conflict of such devastating scale. Some hopeful participants had even begun calling World War I the war to end all wars. But the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 28, 1990, would not achieve that lofty goal. Saddened with the war guilt heavy repercussions and denied entrance into the League of Nations. Germany felt tricked into signing the treaty, having believed any peace would be a peace without victory, as put forward by the President Wilson in his famous 14 points speech of January 19. As the year passed, hatred Versailles Treaty and its authors settled into slundering resentment in Germany that would, 2 decades later, be counted among the cause of World War II. World War I casualties took the lives of more than 9 million soldiers, and 21 million were wounded. The political disturbance surrounding World War I also contributed to the fall of 4 vulnerable imperial dynasties: Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, and Turkey. Legacy of World War I. World War I brought about a massive social upheaval as millions of women entered the workforce to replace men who went to the war and those who never came back. The First Global War also helped to spread one of the world's deadliest global pandemics, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, which killed an estimated between 20 million to 50 million people. World War I has also been referred to as the first modern war. Many of the technologies now associated with military conflict, machine guns, tanks, arsenal, combat, and radio communication, were introduced on a massive scale during World War I. Use of chemicals and biological agents in the warfare remains in effect to this day. At the end of this show, I would like to thank you for listening, and Bizar checks out.